Chapter 2 discusses the marketing environment. We'll cover market dynamics, stakeholders, analyzing the marketing environment, and performing a situation analysis, also known as a SWOT analysis. And just to remind you, these audio lectures are really complementary to the text. So the text will have more content, and you may be tested on more content than we get into in these lectures. The lectures are really intended to sort of highlight the key things that I believe are important for you to know as you move forward in the MBA program. So when we talk about the marketing environment, these are outside forces that affect marketing management's ability to build and maintain successful relationships with target consumers. There's two types of environments. One is the micro environment, and those are any actors close to the company that affect its ability to serve the customers. And then there's the larger macro environment. These are outside, often societal forces that affect the micro environment of the organization itself. So micro, meaning small, that's close to the company, and macro, meaning large or the bigger picture, and those are outside, larger forces. As we talk about dynamics, the text talks about market followers versus a market leader. And in these instances, it's important to understand that being the market leader isn't necessarily always the signal of success. There are many examples of secondary products who come in after the market leader and improve on the market leader's offering. There's some interesting discussion about this in the text, so I encourage you to read this because I'll likely have some of this content in your exams. So really, is there a true first mover advantage? It kind of depends on the topic. It depends on the product category, and it depends on how well that first mover has basically met the needs of the target consumers. Some common problems for those first movers, or what we call market pioneers, is that they might make some marketing mistakes. Those would be in any one of the 4 Ps. They might make product mistakes, meaning that they either make too broad of a product offering or too narrow. They might be stuck with first generation technology or some form of resource limitations. You can think of a lot of examples where the first mover, let's say, for example, Betamax versus VCRs, where Betamaxes came out first, but VCRs took over that category. A lot of other examples in technology, whether it is from thinking about the first forms of removable media storage, so like storage sticks. If you had an old Sony product, you had these Sony sticks that were interchangeable between Sony music players, Sony cameras, and so on. But eventually the SD card became sort of the standard for all cameras and other kinds of removable devices. So now you see the SD slot in most laptops, whereas you don't see a slot for the Sony stick or the Sony memory stick. So there are lots of examples of this. So it can be beneficial to be the first on the market, but it also can be beneficial to sometimes be patient and see what kinds of mistakes those market pioneers make and see how you can improve upon them. When the text talks about stakeholders, we really mean anyone who has a vested interest in the company. And that vested interest doesn't necessarily have to mean an investment, a monetary investment. Those would be shareholders. But we have lots of other examples of stakeholders, from employees to suppliers to the communities themselves, to opinion leaders, customers, influencers, distributors. So a stakeholder is really anyone who benefits in some way when the company does well. And those can be a variety of individuals and entities, not just investors. There are many different acronyms that have been used to illustrate environmental factors. You may, if you have taken or remember from an earlier marketing course, maybe in your undergraduate experience, there was first an acronym called PESTLE, and then that has expanded to this POM, which is what your text uses. And that's basically just trying to abbreviate the different environmental factors that a company needs to consider when doing an environmental review. Those are political, regulatory, or legal in some cases. That's an L, but political, regulatory, economic, social, technological, competition, organization, and the market itself. Let's talk about a few of these macro environmental factors. Specifically, we'll talk a bit about political and legal or regulatory environments, as well as the larger economic environment, the larger societal environment or social environment, and the technological environment. So some things to consider when you're exploring the political environment for your organization are the activities of the government, and that can be anything from your central government to your regional, local, or even your supranational, such as the EU or other, larger trade organizations, or even continent-based governmental regulations. Also, political environments could be any special interests, lobbying, or pressure groups. Finally, trade unions are also something to consider in the political environment. Oftentimes, those unions endorse particular candidates, and then their memberships, the membership individuals in the unions basically vote in block for what is recommended by the unions. So in all of these situations, a company has to be very careful. For example, if they're in the field of new energy, then they have to pay particular attention to some of the political issues and candidates that will be deciding laws and regulations regarding new energy or renewable energy sources. And so those are kinds of things to look at on the horizon. So this macro environment are not necessarily things that the company can directly control, but they are influences that can affect the company. Of course, political parties are also part of this understanding, not only understanding political parties that are currently in power, but past political parties and associations with those. Political environments are closely related to regulatory environments, but those are regulatory is specific to the actual laws that have been established in that area or in that location. So those are both criminal laws as well as civil laws. Codes of practice, these are not necessarily enforceable activities, but they are oftentimes basically codes of behavior that people in a particular industry must follow. And then there is customary practice. This is sort of what you should do. Sometimes, again, those are not necessarily enforceable in courts, but certainly those can be enforceable from your publics or your stakeholders. The broader economic environment that is particularly impactful on an organization are to look at the key economic indicators of the market in which you are going to be selling your product or service. Everything from employment levels to interest rates, taxes, balance of payments, inflation, and trade cycle movements. All of these have an impact on the company, right? Because if your customers have more money in their pockets because of lower taxes, then presumably that reflects they have more buying power, so they can spend more and perhaps make your product or service more affordable to those individuals. And of course, the contrast is true as well. All business cycles are cyclical between upturns, booms, downturns, slumps, and then following over and over again over time. And this doesn't necessarily mean that the slumps, for example, are all of the same length and the booms are all of the same length. So these can be erratic types of cycles. But basically, upturns are where you see rising consumer and business confidence, rising sales, rising prices, and more jobs. Where downturns are associated with falling confidence, falling sales, falling prices, and fewer jobs. The falling prices during a downturn and the rising prices during an upturn are what sometimes confuses people. But basically, think about it this way. When the economy is doing well and your customers have more buyer confidence, they're actually willing to pay more money for your products or services. Whereas in an economic downturn, they're more conservative in terms of, saving their money or making sure that they have enough money to pay for their necessities. And so in that case, what we really see on the market are falling prices. And so companies have to sort of be aware of these cyclical happenings, especially if they, in the P associated with pricing. Now, we could go on for hours talking about how the social environment impacts marketing. That could be anything from demographic population changes, such as increases or decreases, demographic trends, for example, the baby boom generation reaching retirement age, attitude changes, for example, acceptance of more LGBTQ relationships and technology. Even something interesting that students brought up in class are the acceptance of tattoos, which was not very common outside of the military 20, 30, 40 years from now ago. And then patterns of behaviors, for example, more working parents. Now, all of these social environments, what they ultimately mean is that a company can look at these social environmental trends as opportunities. For example, if you market a product that is aimed at an older consumer target market, then certainly the fact that there are more older people living longer lives, more vibrant lives, might be an opportunity for you. However, if you, for example, assume that you're traditionally have marketed to stay-at-home parents, stay-at-home mothers in particular, and your messages are not being received because your target market has now started to work more and there's more opportunity for them, then it might mean that you have to shift your messaging and shift your promotional communications. So it's really important for marketers to understand data. We capture a lot of social information from data from the Census Bureau in the US to IBIS World and other demographic reporting from around the world to assess our social environment. Obviously, technology changes, whether it's IT for processors or storage devices or software, to even communication devices, so smartphones, 4G technology, things like that. And then transport technology. So how is technology affecting transportation? Driverless cars, fast trains, electric cars. So we're seeing demand for more electrical power stations for these kinds of vehicles and so on. And then production technology. How has manufacturing changed and allowed us to make things faster or more reliably or maybe less expensively? And then finally, medical technology is mentioned in your text as well. Then the chapter shifts and talks more about the microenvironment. Those are both internal to the organization and also the competitive environment, so meaning your very close competitors. And as we talk about the competition, the organization, and the market, in the microenvironment analysis, we're really looking at things that are much closer to the organization and things that are controllable to a degree in the sense of understanding the competition, influencing within the organization, and understanding the market better. As for the competitive environment, it's important to understand the distinctions between competitors. So you have direct competitors. These are similar products, but in the same product category. Close competitors, these are alternative products in the same category. Substitutes, a product that fulfills the same need or has the same core benefit. And an indirect competitor is any other product that may be bought instead. An example of competition types is illustrated very, very simply here. So, for example, if you are Domino's Pizza, your direct competition is Papa John's Pizza. But for both, and then if you are McDonald's, your direct competition might be Burger King. And therefore, the red arrows indicate direct competition, but the blue arrows represent indirect competition. This means an alternative product or service that can be bought instead. And so what I mean here is just very, very simply, if you consider direct competition to be pizza, then Domino's and Papa John's are direct competitors. If you believe that this really is all in the same category of sort of fast food, then these are all direct competitors with each other. So really often it depends on how broadly you define your product category to illustrate how who is your direct, your close, or your indirect competitors. And then of course, substitutes here would be any meal that you would cook at home, any other kind of thing that is a substitute. For example, even foregoing food, or thinking about not food, but maybe liquid drinks like coffee or smoothies, things like that. So there are a lot of different ways to define competition, and every company needs to decide how broad they should get. And but it is extremely important when you are assessing the microenvironment to decide who are your direct competitors versus your indirect competitors, because it affects your 4 Ps of product, price, place, and promotion. Now, internal environments are looking within the organization for strengths and weaknesses in terms of everything from your operations to how your organization does research and development, your information systems and data security. This becomes a really important factor as we have moved into sort of cloud computing and online payments and things like that. Human resources, marketing as a operational function, and then finance. And the third microenvironment are your customers or your market. That is, and then here we can look at how customers can be individual consumers or they can be organizations. So we're going to talk later on about consumer behavior versus organizational buying behavior. And in these instances with our customers, when we're doing an environmental analysis, we're really looking for changes in tastes or fashion, changes in purchasing behavior, or even changes in how our product is being used. We'll get into that more in Chapter 3. Speaking of threes, we'll talk about the 3 Cs as well. In your text, they identify the 3 Cs as country, currency, and culture. Especially important because your text really does have a more international approach, and which I like, that it's not so US centric, and it really illustrates how we have to have consideration of the country in which we, not only our home country where our product might be manufactured or where our company might be based, but also our host country, meaning where we might be selling the product. Understanding the currency, of course, not only for exchange rate fluctuations, but also for stability. And then finally, culture and any subcultures that are affected as well. And culture can include anything from religions to, perceptions of the role women play, to minorities and so on in that culture. As we look at that sort of com analysis, when we are selling just within our home country, we can stick with the pressed com as our environment. But when we are selling outside the US, we really have to take into account the pressed com plus these 3 C's of country, currency, and culture. I like to include some additional trends that a lot of the businesses that I work with in my consulting team that we see quite a bit in the last decade have been obviously the rise of multiculturalism, blended families. So if you look at that as an opportunity, you can see how Hallmark and other greeting card companies have turned the trend of blended families into new products, right? So you now see cards aimed at step parents and step siblings much more than you did 10, 20 years ago. We are money rich, time poor. So any products or services that save people time are also opportunities for organizations to grow their business because people are willing to pay for that time gain back. We have demanding customers with very high expectations, and part of that is because they can communicate now with each other very quickly and communicate with the companies very quickly using social media or other technology. So they expect to be listened to very quickly. So gone are the days where you expect that you can only reach someone in the organization from Monday through Fridays from 9 to 5 p.m. Now we kind of expect companies to be on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And that is a challenge for many organizations, of course. Other trends is that in the US, at least, we love our pets. We also love our coffee. We probably spend more money than on both of those 2 things than our grandparents would have ever believed that we would spend. And so these, again, could be opportunities or they could be threats because if people spend more on coffee and they spend more on pets, then they might not spend the same amount of money that they normally would for your product or service. So all of these trends can be opportunities, but could also be potential threats to the organization. Kids with cash. So we see lots of tweens growing as one of the larger powerful groups in demographic research. And ultimately, what we really want to understand is how these trends affect marketing at a broader level, but then at a more specific level, how these trends, whether they're considered opportunities or whether they are considered threats to our particular company. Now, notice I'm not mentioning strengths and weaknesses here because strengths and weaknesses are internal to the organization. All of these macro and micro environmental categories that I've discussed are really intended to be either opportunities or threats to a company because they are external to the organization. So this is a SWOT analysis kind of table or figure that I really like. So I've used it in multiple classes. But it really kind of identifies how strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats are similar to each other and where they're different. So let's kind of just talk about a few things here. So in terms of internal, this is within the organization. So the S and the W really refer to things that are internal to the company. So strengths are internal capabilities that may help a company reach its objectives, and weaknesses are internal limitations that might interfere. Now, on the external side, as I was mentioning on the previous slide, and others are either opportunities, external environmental factors that the company may be able to exploit to its advantage and turn it into a strength, or a threat could be any current or emerging external factors that might challenge the company's performance. So you can think of strengths as internal positives and opportunities as external positives, whereas weaknesses are internal negatives and threats are external negatives. I think that companies themselves find it probably hardest to identify weaknesses because you have to admit what you're not doing very well. I think as students, your biggest challenges are often in terms of exploring opportunities and threats. You tend to identify those as being company dependent, as opposed to understanding that opportunities and threats are really external to the organization. So the organization does not have direct control over the political system. They do not have direct control over laws. They don't have direct control over these societal changes. They don't have direct control over their competitors. They don't have direct control over legal or technological changes. And so, so really make sure as you progress through the class that you understand that, that these are distinctly different categories. As we do this SWOT analysis, of course, we want to match them. So we want to match a positive external opportunity and see if we can pair it with one of our internal strengths. And likewise, we want to take external threats and make sure that we understand how our weaknesses internally may actually make those threats larger than they need to be. And we want to rank them in terms of importance to the organization. Another way to consider SWOT from I used to teach them as well is called the enhanced SWOT analysis. And this type of SWOT analysis is really taking those strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats that you listed previously and really translating them into actual tactical things that you will do within the organization to use strengths to take advantage of opportunities or use strengths to reduce the impact of threats. Likewise, how do you overcome weaknesses that prevent us from taking advantage of opportunities? And how do I address weaknesses that will make these threats a reality? So all of those answers to the questions are then translated into behavioral changes that the company will adopt to make sure that they utilize the SWOT analysis to its full advantage. I'm going to leave you finally with just a way to understand strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats are to fill in this table. So internal factors are when you consider management, marketing, manufacturing, R&D, finance, and your product or service offerings, and identifying what you're good at in those things and what you're bad at in those categories. And then we can take these external factors of economic, competitive, consumer, technology, legal or regulatory, or the industry and market structure, and identifying opportunities and threats in each of those categories as well. So this is chapter 2, your marketing environment. And so we will progress into chapter 3 on consumers. In summary, in chapter 2, we talked about the importance of environmental scanning by identifying key strengths and weaknesses and external opportunities and threats, understanding that stakeholders mean a lot more than simply investors or shareholders, and how their interests impact the organization. And then really to make the environmental analysis form the basis of setting objectives within your organization for marketing planning.